So thank you very much for the comments. Alon gave me his comments before, so I wrote a couple of notices to answer it. First, to the first question, to the ambivalence between the duty of states and the duties of individuals. I don't hear this remark for the first time, so I try to respond to this in a footnote. However, just a footnote. It is footnote number 28, I think, and it is just a footnote. So maybe it didn't work very good. But actually, I think that you can make a difference between the duties of states and the duties of individuals only if you admit and assume that states are kinds of political subjects, so endowed with a specific rationality for itself. And I don't think it is the case, because states are collective entities made of individuals, made of social groups, and they can only display the rationality of the society they represent. So in this sense, states are not billiard balls to be contrasted to individuals, but they are made of individuals. This is, I think, an epistemological problem which has deep roots, and I think it begins at least with the shift from an holistic understanding of society to an individualistic. So actually, when the center of society are individuals, it grew the tendency to understand also the relationship between states as a relationship between billiard balls within subjects which are divided and independent. That is a problem, because states are not, from an epistemological point of view, subjects. They are made of individuals. So that's my first point. So if the state is understood as a collective actor which enacts the rationality of the society it represents, then we don't have any problem any longer on this point, because the duties of individuals are then the duties of the states that are made of those individuals. As to the difference between civic and moral duties, I think that the communicative paradigm can differentiate quite precisely between these different duties, because that refers to different kinds of interaction. We can meet our fellow humans in different forms and in different contexts, as fellow citizens, which implies a much deeper kind of solidarity, or as fellow humans at a more thin kind level of solidarity. But in any case, there is different kinds of interaction. So the specificity of the duty we have towards fellow citizens are maintained. But this does not mean that we don't have any duties toward fellow humans who are not fellow citizens, because these are different kinds of interaction, and each one of these interactions has to be taken seriously, because we are involved in these interactions. So I don't think that from a theoretical point of view we are missing the instruments to understand this specificity of the condition of the fellow citizens, of the civic duties as well. We have them. Other question is whether I could explain them in a correct way. That's not a problem. The question of the third or second question, you put it as a second question. I think the first one has two different aspects, which I try to discuss. And the second question, considering or regarding the paradigm, whether it is possible to apply the communicative paradigm also by analyzing the international relations, the relations between states, of cosmopolitan relation between individuals. I think the assumption that the communicative paradigm is actually a paradigm which has been developed for the internal forum is an assumption which is historically correct, indeed. I think that it is the case. I don't think that it is correct from a merely conceptual point of view. So the expansion of the paradigm is not a kind of paradigmatic imperialism, that it not an export of principles, of theoretical principles which can only be applied within a specific context to a much broader context, and therefore applying kind of violence to this different and more broad context. I think that the communicative paradigm has the conceptual capacity to differentiate these different elements, and so that it's not a kind of imperialism, it's just a shifting of the specific paradigmatic elements to apply them in a different context. So the idea remains the same, the application is different because the context is another one. So something gets lost and something new comes. The paradigmatic elements remain. Well, yeah, I think it's...
So only a brief point on imperialism, and then we have...
Yeah, actually, on an earlier point, just I think what will help me to clarify the relations between moral and civic duties is whether I will understand what it means to be citizens of a cosmopolis in addition to just being a human being within humanity, a member of humanity, and what are the extra duties there. This will help to understand this. You know.
Indeed, that's a difficult question, because the question is that when we meet fellow citizens, that it is a context from which civic duties can arise, that it's clear, that's not unambiguous. The question arises when we talk about the interactions between human beings at the more general level. What is arising there, what's growing there, are they just moral duties, or we can talk also in this case of a kind of political duties? The question is, I think, is related to the kind of institutions that can implement or even enforce these duties. Because when we meet only at the level, I think when we are touched, colère publique mondiale, by some injustice, some of the many injustices happening in the world, this case is, I think it is moral duty to react. Because we are touched, we are somehow involved in the suffering and in the problems of fellow humans. So this is kind of moral duty to react from a communicative point of view. But if we address, we don't have just this kind of reaction. We have institutions that react to this situation. And insofar as we have institutions, which are the international organization actually in all the form they take, in this sense, we can say that we are not just fellow humans, fellow sufferers who share one world. We are citizens of the cosmopolis, which is made not just of a very vague humanity made of shared values, but is a community made of institutions which should be developed, and this is the kind of citizenship of the world I try to address. This is, I must acknowledge, it's the field that has to be developed, because there are just a couple of ideas, not very good developed now.
Thank you. Hello?
So that actually may be a really good point for me to intervene, because I wanted to suggest maybe that the gist of this wonderful paper is that a relationship between fellow humans is inevitably morally prior to relationship between fellow citizens. And if that's the case, then the missing link or the missing rubric before the tripartition of public law is private law. And that may explain the question yesterday regarding the attraction to metaphors from private law, because private law addresses our relationship, our interpersonal relationship, our relationship that are not that are before the relationship that we have as fellow citizens. Now, if this is the case, I think that those notions that we may develop as per our relationship in this horizontal dimension have to be prior to our relationship in this first dimension of domestic private public law, but then can reappear in a different guise and with a different set of institutional constraints and implications at the cosmopolitan law. In other words, for me, the way to render the third dimension of the cosmopolitan law that captures our interpersonal relationships as quote-unquote citizens of the world is first to realize, to analyze our interpersonal relationship prior to being citizens, right? And then we can see what remains after we enter into relationship as citizens within a state, and after our states enter into relationship in an international community. But it's hard for me to see how you can render this third layer robust without first kind of thinking about the simpler question, right? Which is the kind of the natural law, the natural order context in which we encounter one another.
Okay. So,
briefly, because we
yes, I try to defend, responding to Alon, the position of the citizen actually of the fellow human, not of the citizen, because you made the position of the citizen very strong. Responding to your remarks, I have to defend the specificity of the position of the citizens. I think I wouldn't say that the interaction between fellow humans is prior to the relationship between citizens. Simply, they are different kinds of interactions. I wouldn't say there is a priority in an axiological sense. Both are very important. As regards the very interesting question of the relationship between private and public law from this understanding, I would say that my approach is actually a typical public law approach. So, but in any case, well, that's against public law, bro. Well, I won't make the case for public law too strong. But in any case, I think that the question, in my approach, for example, as in the approach of contract theory of state, the advantage, if you address the question of public law, is that the distinction between public and private law is not that strong as in the traditional understanding of state theory. So in this sense, you can say, I dare to say that my approach is a public law approach, which in any case privileges an interaction between individuals, which in any case is not an interaction which aims at constructing just private relationship between them, but it aims at constructing the public dimension starting from the individual. So in this sense, private law and public law are not enemies anymore from this perspective. But in any case, I wouldn't go with, for example, Gunther Teubner in the sense that public law has to be privatized, which is not what I mean. In any sense, I wouldn't understand public law in the sense of the traditional administrative law of the Polizeistaat, which is very influential in a certain understanding of the state, at least in continental Europe.
So there are many commentators and not enough time. So what I ask is now we have 5 on my list. Ivan, Fox Descent, Tomer, Doreen, Lorenzo, and Jean. You speak briefly, and you
I try to answer very briefly
afterwards.
Right,
just take the mic, please.
Maybe I'll answer at the end.
Yeah.
Well, Sergio, thank you very much for the paper. It It's very provocative, and I found it really interesting. But I think the structure that you suggest in the paper faces a certain dilemma, and Alon was, I think, at least indirectly pointing to it. So let me just say what I mean. The crucial passage from your paper is the passage that you've referred to a number of times, so did Alon, on the last page of the paper, where you say that individuals within a state have sort of two roles, one as citizens of the state, one as citizens of the cosmopolis. So here's the dilemma that I wish to pose to you, that I think the view you're arguing for faces. You want to say that the legitimacy of sovereignty from obligations to others, outsiders' perspective, has to be bottom up, come from the bottom up. And so you say that individuals within a state have these dual roles. On the one hand, they're citizens of the state, and so we can imagine that they consent to the state, and the state gets their authority that way. On the other hand, you say they're citizens of the cosmopolis, and there's a sense in which they authorize the state. To act in a cosmopolitan manner. So the first horn of the dilemma is simply, what gives these citizens standing to authorize the state to act for others, right? Within the state, we can, stretching and pulling, make some sense of these citizens having the capacity to consent to the state. It's far less clear to me that we can view them as having authority to authorize the state to act for others. The state may have moral obligations towards others, but it's not going to come from any relationship of authority between the state and the people immediately subject to it. So that's sort of one horn of the dilemma. The other horn is, if we imagine that the individual, when you're talking about individuals, you're talking about outsiders as citizens of the cosmopolis authorizing a foreign state with respect to them, then I think it really does stretch the bounds of what's credible to think that some sort of consent-based story can have any effect here, right? I mean, we just don't usually think that outsiders, that foreign nationals, have in some sense, even tacitly, consented to the powers that are assumed by foreign states. I think it's a big stretch to even say that, to make a consent story work with respect to one's own state. To be honest. But when we're talking about foreign nationals and a consent story for other states, I think it's even more difficult. So to sum up, the problem is either the consent story is implausible if we think of the individual as being the outsider in the first instance. If the individual is the insider, the citizen vis-a-vis the state, then the individual lacks standing to authorize the state vis-a-vis foreign nationals.
Tomer?
Just two quick questions. The first one, what kind of work does the concept of solidarity do here in your work? Does it the motivation for acting or the justification for acting? And whether we need this concept at all, we can think about duties and responsibility toward others without solidarity. So I wonder, what do you think it's add, this concept? The second question is that in the transnational arena, we don't have just individual and states, we also have other personas like multinational corporation and many kind of organization. I wonder how does they enter to the community political landscape that you talk about.
Can you give it to Lorenzo, the mic?
Yes. So I really like the taxonomic efforts, but I have a problem with the conclusion, and I quote, you say, thus, it can be maintained that sovereign actors have an obligation to solidarity only if they implement in their actions a practical use of reason. So it sounds like saying, well, there is an obligation only if states impose upon themselves prior obligation of practical reason that has to look like what you say, in the sense that, well, I really don't see how you can you can explain the necessity of acting in a practical, in using the practical use of reason that you describe, without presupposing that there is a sort of necessity to it. And also, like the conditions that you set out, well, for this practical use of reason, in fact, betrays a sort of reason fundamentalism. You say that it has to be universalistic, it has to be non-metaphysical, it has to be. But well, in fact, when you say that this practical reason exists, you're making a strong metaphysical commitment. You're saying that reason is there and exists out there as a fundamental feature of the world, and this is not a non-metaphysical statement.
What's me?
And then Doreen, and then you have 2 minutes to.
2 seconds.
Yeah, I'm.
Impossible.
Yeah, I know, but.
I'm sympathetic to the sort of moral implication, what drives us morally. But I wonder 2 things. First of all, would you argue, therefore, that states that are not fully democratic are therefore not legitimate, and what follows from that? Number 1, and number 2, so Ayal's approach is to attempt to expand reconceive sovereignty in part or in whole, I hope it's in part, in terms of this trustee of humanity idea. Yours looks rather different, since you don't speak in terms of humanity, but you talk about citizens of a cosmopolis. Is this a distinction that makes a difference?
Doreen, please pass the mic. You can.
So I think my question actually takes some elements from others and maybe summarizes some of the features that they asked about. So there's a binary in the argument between states and individuals, and as you yourself said, there's this missing element of institutions that we want more to address, and I think it's an important element when we think about the communicative aspect. So if we're thinking of the imagery of the interaction in the international sphere as merely within states, between states, and among individuals, then we're actually missing a lot of the action, and that probably not giving us a good understanding of what kind of communicative action we're talking about when we're talking about international interaction. And so when we think about ourselves as part of a cosmopolis, I think we're mostly thinking of ourselves through our interaction within these different networks and institutions, and not outside of them. And that's actually where the arena for such a cosmopolis may actually be situated. But if that's what makes the qualitative difference, that is the condition to conceive the international as a cosmopolis, then we hit some kind of a circularity, I think, because then the basis for the communicative action as a basis of duties and responsibility is conditioned upon the institutional infrastructure and the extent to which our communications are actually thick or thin. So and that's problematic because it's both the justification and in some ways the thing that we actually would like to enhance: procedures, better elements of voice, etc. So in some ways it cannot do both. I don't think it can do both. Both justify, both provide us the background against which we look, and at the same time, if that's what it does, how can it be the criteria against which we ask for something better, to enhance communication and procedures for a better and more legitimate, justified international order?
So 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
And
Well,
the rest-
I try.
And the rest in your paper.
Okay. Yes, indeed. Sorry, I won't be able to answer the question in a correct way, but I try to say at least something. As regards the relationship between individuals and authorization of states, I think that actually citizens authorize their states to act in some way. So in this sense, it is the fellow humans who are not citizens of these states are addressed actually because they see some places to be heard as guaranteed by this situation. But the relationship is between the citizens and the state to which they belong, actually. That's the principle, the most important thing. And the relationship between solidarity and duties. Well, I think that I led back actually the idea of duties towards non-citizens to the idea of solidarity. I think that is acceptable, but I will think about it, whether it is really the correct understanding. And the other actors which play a role in international relations. I think my perspective is actually strongly public law perspective. So in this sense, other actors are just play a quite marginal role from this understanding. Why that? Because I think that actors which are legitimated in a democratic sense should play the most important role. That's my approach. The practical use of reason, is it possible? What is the meaning that the state should apply a certain understanding of reason? This is a complicated thing, because indeed that seems a kind of metaphysical assertion. What do I mean with this? I mean that actually we are engaged in a discourse on which rationality is displayed by actors in international relations. And there is different understanding of how or what can be seen and as a solution in the sense of a rationality that can respond to these questions. And the question is how the intellectual address the question. And so in this sense, the state is not an entity which applies certain abstract rationality, but is actually the public processes which lead to a certain action of the state is the reaction to a public debate. And it is what I'm trying to contribute to, actually. It is a metaphysical commitment. It is a question, it's a very difficult question to address. Is the communicative paradigm full of metaphysical assumption or not? I would dare not to respond to this very difficult question here. State that are not democratic are not legitimate. Yes, it is somehow the conclusion of my paper. It is a very radical one, that's true. I don't mean that we should not talk with non-democratic state, but I think that legitimacy has to be taken very seriously, and I don't think that legitimacy can be understood correctly without an exclusive reference to, sovereignty should be taken seriously only with a reference to legitimacy. And in this sense, we have to talk with everyone what we should keep in mind, that legitimacy is not a joke. Institutional aspect, yes, that's not the point of my paper, indeed. I address actually a philosophical problem, and not that much how this philosophical problem can be translated into procedures or institutional structures. I think it is possible, and it is a quite important challenge how to develop a dialogical legal discourse and how to apply this dialogical legal discourse within legal structure and institutions. Generally speaking, the legal discourse is not precisely characterized by a dialogical understanding, rather by a hierarchical understanding. And this reinterpretation of the legal discourse is a very strong challenge for the future, but it's not the aim, I must say, of this paper. Thank you very much.